Chapter 4, beginning in chapter 5. We're in chapter 5, verse 1. Vanity. It's more than just what you've got in the bathroom, right? The vanity sink, which is there. We feel like we are absolutely in control of everything. And James talks about how we make a plan that we're going to go here and there and to this city and to that city. And he says, how foolish are you? Our life is nothing more than a vapor. Therefore, you need to say and have the attitude as the Lord wills. If the Lord wills, we'll go to this city or that city. But we feel like we're in control. And that's true many times with our health. It's true many times with our relationships. It's true many times with our plans. And it's true in so many ways. And what we're going to learn today as we go through here, that one of the ways in which we show vanity is our thought that we are in control. Remember that vanity is worthlessness, which we run across, and so we'll see this so often. Now, looking at chapter 5, verse 1, walk prudently when you go into the house of God, and draw near to hear rather than to give the sacrifice of fools, for they do not know that they do evil. All right, what's that passage teaching us, you think? He's saying be very careful before you walk in a temple and begin to offer worship. Because what's the danger?
You got your mind somewhere else.
The danger of having your mind somewhere else. Let's play Bible characters. The only passage most of us can quote out of Leviticus is Leviticus chapter 10, verse 1 and 2. The two oldest sons of Aaron, and what are their names? Nadab and Abihu. And out of all of Leviticus, it's so crazy. We remember that, but we remember it because we preach it so often. What did they do? They offered, the old translations say profane fire. Newer translations would say unauthorized fire. They just walked into the temple. And remember, as you walk into the temple, you pass the first altar where sacrifice was, and you were to take that fire that came from the sacrifice or gift to God and use it to light the incense. Nadab and Abihu thought that was too much work, and so they got fire from somewhere else, and they lit one, then they lit the other. And because they did not regard God, God destroyed them. Uzziah, the king, was one of the greatest kings of all of Israel. He was near the end of the southern kingdom, restored much of the worship toward God. And he was Isaiah's favorite king, is the one he grew up under. He reigned for 52 years. It's the one we read of in Isaiah chapter 6, where Isaiah is having difficulty because Uzziah just died. Uzziah one day decided that he was king and he could do whatever he wanted, and he went into the temple to offer sacrifice. He didn't want to wait on the Levites to do it. He was going to do it because he was king. And they kept telling him, no, don't do it, don't do it. And as he did it, he pointed toward the priest to tell them that he could do whatever he wanted to do. And he was struck with leprosy, and that leprosy spread throughout his body. And he spent the last 15 years of his reign in quarantine away from everybody else. And as you go through Ananias and Sapphira, New Testament, okay? Acts chapter 4, 32, the very last verse of chapter 4. Barnabas sells some property and gives the proceeds to the church to help the church because it's increasing and it's growing. Ananias and Sapphira in chapter 5 saw the fame that Barnabas got. And so what did they do? They sold land, but what did they do with the money? They lied about how much they got, and so they would get the same amount of fame as Barnabas, but they were still going to keep some of it. And because of that, what did God do to them? Struck them dead. What you'll see in the Old Testament and New Testament is how seriously God takes worship. And one of the issues that happens in modern day worship is we've changed it into a fungible product. We've changed it into a consumer activity. And so you go to whatever church kind of meets your needs, whatever church sort of fits you. I remember many years ago in a congregation where I preached, a congregation across town, they were of a denomination, but they decided to switch it up. And so the first day of the week, their band would play country music. The second day of the second Sunday, they would come through and they did country, then they did contemporary Christian. The third one, they would have a sort of rock sort of thing. And then the fourth one, they would have the old hymns and such. Because they're trying to make everybody happy. And what happened is they started having people come to church only once a month because that was the week that pleased them. And what happens to us in church many times is instead of focusing on pleasing God, we end up focusing on pleasing ourselves. And that's not to say that worship should be boring, because it shouldn't. This is the greatest message in the world. And if you make church boring, you're really doing something wrong, because there's nothing boring about it. But it is to say that God is God and we are not. And that you need to worship in a way in which God has prescribed. That's an important thing. And so Solomon says here, you be prudent before you walk into this place. Now that idea of hear, that word there, that's going to come back to what Samson would have said in 1 Samuel, Samuel would have said in 1 Samuel 15:22 when he's talking to Saul. And he says, you know what? God prefers a true heart over sacrifice. And what he's saying there is not that God doesn't like worship, but your heart needs to be right if you're going to worship right. It's possible to worship right and your heart be wrong, and it's just a waste. You've got to have the heart and you've got to have the action correct as well. And so he says, be careful when you go in. Don't give the sacrifice to fools, people who don't know any better, because they are doing evil in their worship. The second part of worship, this is the everyday action. Verse 2, don't be rash with your mouth. Let not your heart utter anything hastily before God. For God is in heaven, you on earth. Therefore, let your words be few. All right, what are we saying there? Don't overpromise. You ever see people overpromise? And if they would have just stopped somewhere, everybody would have been happy, but they go on and on and on. Out at Titus, in the Bible class, we've been going through all the way through the book of Judges. And we had a lot of fun with Jephthah. Remember, Jephthah was a man who was born from a prostitute. Nobody liked him, but he was really good at fighting because of the way he'd grown up. He'd always been bullied growing up. And so Israel determines that he needs to be their next judge. He's going to lead them into battle. And if he would have said, yes, sir, that's great, everything would have been wonderful. But Jephthah wanted to look religious to everybody who was around. He wanted to look holy and more faithful to God than any of these other people because he had a complex because of his family history. And so what was this promise? Whatever came out of his house first was going to be what? Sacrificed. Okay? Whatever comes out of my house when I come home first, I'm going to sacrifice. Now, he probably thought it would be a goat. Probably thought it would be a cow. He may have hoped it was a cat. Just kidding. Okay? It was his daughter. And so what we always argue about when we do the book of Judges, did he really sacrifice his daughter? Or did he just make it where his daughter could never marry? And being a book of Judges, it's like raising boys in the house. When you see something, always assume the worst. All right? When you see a mess, always assume the worst. That's how you raise boys. I think in the book of Judges, you always assume the worst. He overpromised. Now, how does that apply to our worship? Sometimes we have a vanity, a haughtiness. We see somebody sin and we put them on a lower level. Oh, look how they act. They're not as righteous as I am. And guess what? Do we sin? Yes. But we sin in good ways and they sin in bad ways. That's kind of how we put it, right? Sin is sin. And all those roads lead to the same place. So be careful with your words and what you say. Be careful, otherwise you'll be bound by your words and the things that you do. I make a joke a lot of times about my Greek class. I was taking a test one time, and I was scared to death because Greek was really hard for me. And so there I am taking a test, and I said, God, if you'll let me get an A on this test, I'm going to be a missionary to Timbuktu and all this stuff. And I failed it. So here I am in Benton, Kentucky. All right? You know, thankfully God did not answer that promise, that prayer which was there. But sometimes we make a promise, and then in breaking that promise, we end up sinning. What Solomon is saying is, in your worship to God, watch what you say. The less you say, the less you have to defend. Now, should you preach the gospel to other people? Absolutely. But when you're teaching, the less you say, the better it is. Now, that's not to say we should have short sermons. But James chapter 3, verse 1 says, those who teach need to be careful. You're under a stricter judgment. And so that's what we see when we look there in verse 2. Now, looking there in verse 3, dream comes through much activity. A fool's voice is known by his many words. When you make a vow to God, don't delay to pay it. He has no pleasure in fools. Pay whatever you have vowed. It's better not to avow than to vow and not pay. Don't let your mouth cause your flesh to sin, nor say before the messenger of God that it was an error. Why should God be angry at your excuse and destroy the work of your hands? Okay? So, worship is dangerous. Is something you have to be very, very careful about. Now, when I say worship is dangerous, here is what I mean. Electricity is dangerous. Even in this building, there's 120 volts coursing through this ceiling, coursing through our walls, all around. You don't want to touch a bare wire anywhere around here. If you're working on the electrical things, if you're working on things like that, you want to be very careful that you practice safety as you're working on those things. Don't touch the wires, right? Okay? Now, somebody might say, well, we're going to be safe, and so let's not even have electricity. And I say, nope, we got to have air conditioning, right? That's an important thing. Nope, I like the lights. I like, the PowerPoint that we have. I appreciate electricity, but I also appreciate the danger that's brought along with it. And so worship is the same way. We want to worship, but we come before God with a level of respect, realizing that it can be dangerous if we're nonchalant about worship. It can be dangerous if we're not listening to what the Bible teaches about how we worship. It can be dangerous if we don't follow what God has told us to do. And so Solomon is saying, make your words few, be very diligent in what you do, because this is serious stuff to come before the throne room of God. It is a very serious situation that you and I face as we walk through and go in here. Yeah.
I always was under the understanding we're not supposed to make deals with God.
Yeah, you're not supposed to make deals with God. No.
Supposed to, right?
No.
So it's not good.
It's not a good situation to make a vow to God in these sort of things.
Because he's going to do it anyway, however he wants to do it.
Yeah.
Okay, that's what I
Yeah.
thought.
Yeah. And be very careful whenever you think that you want to make a deal with God, because you're going to be under a bind. You're going to be bound by it in the way in which you go through life.
Yeah.
And as a salesman, the less promises you have to make, many times the better it is. Not that you're being lazy, but it's better to under-promise and over-deliver. And in our worship to God, sometimes it's better to over-deliver and go beyond, but we've got to be careful about what we say. We've got to be careful about what we tell everybody else that we're doing as well. See, Ananias and Sapphira, going back to Acts 5, they gave money freely to the church. Wonderful thing, right? They delivered something which very few other people in church were doing. But where they ran into trouble was when they were talking about it, they overpromised. And so I think what Solomon's saying here, be careful when you're talking to people, because there sometimes is a temptation to go beyond what you're willing to do or what life happens.
Would it become like a bragging thing?
Yeah, it can become a bragging thing. Yeah. It's always struck me strange because of how we talk about giving. Barnabas gave his, he sold his property, gave the money to the church. And he told everybody in church, and it obviously made a big point, because then here comes Ananias and Sapphira. You get over to 2 Corinthians chapter 8 and 9, Paul is talking to the Corinthian church, which is a very wealthy church, and he's saying, you know what? Macedonia gave a lot of money, and they're impoverished. And I don't want to come to Corinth and be embarrassed because these rich people aren't giving like the poor people are. And so there is a comparison, a back and forth, which is there. But I think we got to be very careful. You got to be very careful about what you say, because it can cause people to give for the wrong reason. It can cause us to run into issues one way or the other, whatever that might be. That's an important thing for us to notice. Okay. And so as you go through there, that's what you're going to notice. Now, then we go to social justice. Start here in verse 8. If you see the oppression of the poor and the violent perversion of justice and righteousness in the province, do not marvel at the matter. For the high official watches over high official, and high officials over them. Moreover, the profit of the land is for all, even the king is served from the field. All right. What you see here is a cycle, and I probably should have covered it more last week. We have a cycle last week about how the young and the old work back and forth. Here you see the rich and the poor. Okay? Everybody has a boss. All right, you can be the serf in the field. You've got the guy who is running the manor. You've got the manor in the field. You have the Lord. You got the Lord, then you have the king. But guess what? The king is not going to be able to survive unless somebody's out there in the field. And that is medieval economics, but it applies here as well. Elon Musk or whoever is not going to be launching a rocket unless the guy is sweeping the floor in the factory and making sure that the area where they're building is clean. And so every one of us rely on someone else. And so if you feel like you're important, if you have a lot of people who are under you, you realize somebody else is over you as well. Now, James loves the book of Ecclesiastes, and that's why when you go over to the book of James, chapter 4, I'm not sure, but I think it's chapter 4, he says, listen, the poor are crying out. The rich are oppressing the poor. Don't you realize they're praying to God who is over the rich? Don't you realize when you mistreat those under you, you're going to be mistreated yourself? And so you have this cycle which is going on. And so there's that second level of vanity. First level is worship wrong. Second level is when there's oppression happening, realize when you oppress those under you, you have those who are above you who will enact punishment, which is there. Now, verse 10, if you love silver, you're never going to be satisfied with silver. Nor he who loves abundance with increase, this also is vanity. Verse 11 goes with it. When goods increase, they increase who eat them. So what profit have owners except to see them with their eyes? All right. If you have money, guess what you want? Money. John Rockefeller lived well over a century ago. Richest man ever. His holdings comprised at least 8% of the U.S. economy. So much richer than any of these guys we talk about today. One time a reporter was talking to him and he said, Rockefeller, you have all these millions of dollars. What more could you want? And he said, I just want $1 more. He never had enough. And if money is what you want, you can never have enough money. If fame is what you want, you'll never have enough fame. That's why those things are vanity. You'll never be satisfied if you're chasing after the things of the world. That's why you need the things of God, and that's why it's so important. Now, verse 11, you get a raise, get a raise at work. What happens to your expenses? Do they stay the same? All right. And you end up sort of broker than you were when you started, right? Okay. And what happens a lot of times when we get a raise at work, our expenses increase as well, right? You're going to supersize your meal at McDonald's, which I don't even know if they do that anymore. You're going to raise up whatever it is you're spending. And so you can be a millionaire and still be broke. That sounds strange, but oftentimes it's true. A person can have a ton of money, and actually they're in a ton of debt. And there is more stress in them than the fellow who's down here working minimum wage. And so Solomon says it's vanity to seek after more silver because that's not what pleases you. That's not what brings you true joy and true comfort. Now, Does that mean that we shouldn't want to raise at work? No, you should always want to raise. You should always want to better yourself, but you understand that just because you're making more money doesn't necessarily mean that you need to spend more money. You need to realize that cycle which is there. Verse 12 is interesting. The sleep of a laboring man is sweet, whether he eats little or much, but the abundance of the rich man will not permit him to sleep. This is kind of going on with what we said before. You got a guy who's working on minimum wage. He is working hard at the garage. He's working hard wherever, at the factory, wherever it might be. He is tuckered out. He goes home and he lays down and he sleeps. He's exhausted because of his work. He's able to sleep. The guy who owns the factory, the guy who owns the field, you would think his life would be so much better. He's not able to sleep at night because he is stressed. And you would think he'd be happier, but he is stressed because of all the things going on. What Solomon is telling us here is the vanity of how oftentimes life doesn't make sense. You would think the owner of the factory would have a better life than the guy who's on the floor working himself to death. But sometimes those guys who are owning, sometimes those guys that we look up to and we're jealous, if we lived a life in their situation, we would want to come right back. It would not want to be exactly, they're not where we would want to be. Severe evil, verse 13, which I've seen under the sun, riches kept for their owner to his hurt, but those riches perish through misfortune. When he has a son, there is nothing for him to give in his hand. As he came from his mother's womb, naked shall he return. To go as he came, he shall take nothing from his labor, which he carries away in his hand. And this is a severe evil. All right, a guy works his whole life to develop a legacy. Works his whole life to be able to give to the next generation, and then he dies, and there's no one to give it to. How many people have worked overtime, have had a side gig, have labored and labored and labored to get ahead financially, and then they realize because they're working so hard on that, their marriage has fallen apart. Their children have not had a father or had a mother, had parents. Their legacy, their children are not growing up in the Lord because we focused on this so much to the detriment of our family. Because we focused on this so much to the detriment of our marriage. Because we focused on this so much to the detriment of our own health. As was said earlier, death is going to come to all people someday. And we have to realize what the primary focus is. We have to realize the importance of family, the importance of raising our children, the importance of giving ourselves to God, the importance of taking care of ourselves and giving what we have for God. And so you see the troubles this man has. Now let's skip down to chapter 6. There's an evil, he says, which I've seen under the sun is common among men. A man to whom God has given riches and wealth and honor, so he lacks nothing for himself of all he desires. And yet God does not give him power to eat of it, but a foreigner consumes it. This is vanity, and it's an evil thing. If a man has 100 children, verse 3, and lives many years, so the days of his years are many, but his soul is not satisfied with goodness, and indeed he has no burial, I say the stillborn child is better than he, for it comes from vanity and departs in darkness, and his name is covered with darkness. What's that saying to us? The secret to life is not making money. Now, that's not to say that God wants us to be impoverished. He doesn't. The secret of life is not gaining fame. Secret of life is giving yourself fully to God and living, as we looked in the last chapter last week, a life of balance. There's work. There's family. There's time for self. Now, all of us are unbalanced in some way. Don't take that the wrong way. All of us are unbalanced. But our goal is to have what we give to our family, have what we give to work, have what we give to ourselves. And when you have children, when this is going, that's going on, it's hard to stay balanced. As Solomon is saying, focus on that balance that you need to have in life. Now, let's skip down to chapter 6, look at verse 7. All the labor of man is for his mouth, and yet his soul is never satisfied. What more has the wise man than the fool? What more does the poor man have than those who know how to walk before the living? Better is the sight of the eyes than the wandering of desire. And this also is vanity and grasping for the wind. Whatever one is, he has been named already, for it is known that he is man, and he cannot contend with him who is mightier than he. Since there are many things that increase vanity, how is man the better? For who knows what is good for man in life, all the days of his vain life, which he passes like a shadow, and who can tell a man what will happen to him after the sun? All right, dangers in life. Look there in verse 7. Short-lived satisfaction. Short-lived satisfaction. You have a little bit after one day, you spend your whole paycheck, then you're hungry at the end of the month, hoping that you get paid again soon. And when you live hand to mouth like that, it's short satisfaction. As soon as you lose your job, you have no cushion, you run into trouble. Another problem, finding why God put you here. It doesn't matter if you're wise, it doesn't matter if you're a fool. If you don't live with purpose, when life is over, it feels like a failure. Live intentionally. Live with a purpose. Verse 9, there's always something better. The guy walking on the side of the road wishes he had a bike. The guy on the bike wishes he had a car. The guy with the car wishes he had a better car. The guy with the better car wishes he had an airplane. And it goes on and on. Wherever you are, there's always something better. But whatever you receive, you're not satisfied, and you always want more until you realize that's not the goal of life. That's not what life consists in. Creativity is limited, and life is futile. It's an important thing for us to notice. All right, life, verse 12, is a shadow. You have a shadow. I think I'm casting a shadow somewhere here. Hopefully I'm not a vampire. There you go. You have a shadow in your life, and then when you move, that shadow's gone. And isn't that the way life is? My dad used to tell me later in his life, he said, I'm an 18-year-old stuck in a 70-year-old man's body. He said, sometimes I'll get up, especially if the medicine is working, and I feel 18, and I look down and I see my hands, and I think, what happened to me? And I don't know if that's the case with everybody else, but man, life goes by quickly, doesn't it? We are a fourth of the way through 2025? And sometimes I still want to write 2023 on my checks. We are a fourth of the way through this year. Life goes so fast. Don't wait until the last day until you realize who you want to be and what you want to do. Make a decision that you're going to live life rightly. Live a life where you can look back and be proud of what you've done and who you are. That's true with family. That's true with work. It's true with recreation. Give yourself fully to God.